Tuesday afternoon and it's 12:30 on a not so sunny day, but it's still a beautiful day and a fabulous day to be alive. And my special guest this week on the Mindset Michelle TV show is the amazing Roger McDonald. He's also known as the business biographer. He is an accomplished writer after many, many years and literally been taught by some of the toughest Fleet Street journos around. He also has a really fascinating history of getting his writer's wings in the war back in the 70s in Zimbabwe. So lots of amazing and interesting stories, I'm sure, today from Roger. And Roger, welcome. And do you want to share a little bit about yourself with everybody?
Yes, thank you, Michelle. And also thank you for the work you're doing, bringing so many people to the fore and introducing them to such a wonderfully wide and diverse world. So yes, it's been great fun over quite some time. I learnt some pretty important lessons fairly young as a young trainee journalist and cadet, particularly in Zimbabwe, well, as was Rhodesia at the time, until it, of course, became Zimbabwe after a particularly vicious civil war in 1980. So that was a good grounding for me in gathering information and turning data into knowledge and, I hope, sometimes wisdom.
Were you always called to write? Were you writing when you were younger, as a child and everything?
Yes. I was the third of three children. My oldest sister was, I think, particularly talented as a young girl. And I think she taught me really to read and write well before I went to school. So by the time I got to school, I was pushed up a grade and then another grade because it was a very crowded school, and not having to teach one of the little terrors to read and write was a good move for the teachers.
Yeah, I guess that those early years, those formative years, if you had older brothers and sisters that were helping you, then that would have been very helpful.
It surely did, yeah.
And some of your, when you were growing up, who were some of your favourite authors then? Who did really inspired you?
Look, at the very beginning, it was kind of young adult fiction, really. I was reading a bit precociously, I suppose. And by the time I got to senior school, I was 2 years younger than everybody else in my grade. And yet I was reading ridiculously mature stuff for my age. The Russian classics and German philosophers and these kinds of people. And it was probably just a bit ahead of my time, but still that's what I liked.
And, fabulous.
There you go.
Yeah, I think, I remember strangely as well during school holidays, and then when I first started working, actually reading like The Lord of the Rings, all of the different books, and those were the times to actually get through some of those epic kind of 3 or 4 volume books and things.
Yes, I always had my nose buried in a book somewhere, and from quite a young age was writing stories and bits of poetry and really bits of everything. I was never without a book or a notebook.
Fabulous. But I guess one of the interesting things, because there's not many people that have seen like and I don't know the words, but maybe the horrors of war that you would have seen in Rhodesia or Zimbabwe. So you may have quite a different, you're obviously working in corporate world now and have for quite a while, but you may have a slightly different view again on what does success mean to you?
Yes, I'm glad you asked me that, and I knew it was coming, so I've had a bit of time to think about it. And I was going to say that success is kind of the freedom to make your own decisions and see them through, But then I thought a little more clearly about it, and that I remembered a teacher, quite a stern kind of a man, who had a no-nonsense approach to life and philosophy. And the one line that he left me was, and it perpetuates almost daily for me, was that freedom isn't doing what you want, but doing what you ought. And that has stuck with me for life. And that, I think, underlines everything to do with success. Maybe, I don't know, maybe the ultimate success would be attending my own funeral as a fly on the wall. But I suppose that could be a kind of hell as well, as you listen to the lies and the half-truths as people try to embroider the eulogy and not necessarily make a success of it. But I guess, no, in the final ledger, and I'm still to write that page, I'm still struggling away with it, I guess success to me would be giving more than you take and keeping quiet about it.
Yeah, and that's why I was interested, because for many people, especially people we both know in the business sort of world, when they're defining success, it's actually more around the freedom to be able to do and have what you would like when you would like it. But I love your take on it and how it's about doing the right thing. I think people like yourself that may have experienced, like in Rhodesia and I'm sure at other times, really difficult human circumstances where people don't have personal and individual freedoms, it does then change that sense and that idea around freedom. And you know, we've had a lot of things in the media again about the Holocaust and Holocaust survivors, and that whole thing about, you know, that the remembering, and that not everywhere in the world people have had choices about how to live and what to do.
Exactly. And in some senses, and I don't want to over dramatize it, but the transition from, you know, white minority colonial rule to black majority rule was a very difficult time. Many thousands of lives were lost in quite brutal and terrible circumstances. And the promise of Zimbabwe after the war was so high and so golden, it seemed to us at the time. We saw it as the Switzerland of Africa. And that's how it started off. But within 4 years, Mugabe's brutality began to come to the fore, to the point where it was no longer safe for journalists to tell the truth, or at least there was several versions of truth. And if you were on the wrong side of a particular version, then you faced the very real threat of torture and death. And so it does sober you, I suppose, when you're caught up in circumstances like that and feel the necessity to return to your roots, because it simply wasn't safe for me and my family.
Exactly. And you know, it's not just even in the past. There's actually no journalists in countries like China now from the West. So, you know, the lessons of history, if you like, don't necessarily finish with one country going through it. They kind of repeat in the cycle of humanity, if you like.
Yeah.
So given that you have been through some quite difficult circumstances quite young in your career, and now obviously you're here in Australia, you have a thriving, successful business working with corporate and supporting people to find their own stories and find their own ways through whatever their experiences, their life experiences have been, and to share that. So I know that viewers are very interested in watching today to find out more about how they can also tell their stories and their journeys. So what might be 3 tips for a successful story or a successful mindset?
Right. Interestingly, along the way with both my career in journalism and subsequently in marketing communications, I'd often tell people as I walk corridors and through factories and through businesses that curiosity is perhaps the beginning of a great story in itself. And I'd look at people doing work and doing jobs and ask them, why are you doing that? What is the outcome? And they'd look at me as though I was a bit odd and saying, well, I don't know, it's just my job. And then when you explain to them how that job fitted into the overall complex of a larger business, they began to see that their story was actually more interesting than they'd ever thought. So curiosity is quite important to start with. So if I had 3 tips, I guess the first would be a really quite spiritual one, which is to understand why we're here on this planet. And for me, it was kind of beaten into me at school. When I grew up, school was a pretty violent place. And the teachers were very keen to make sure you understand that what they had to say stuck. But what did stuck was, to me, the importance of love, simply love. And it's the most fundamental law of them all. And if you can genuinely love, in a sense, you don't need any other tips at all. But, in the absence of a full and comprehensive love, and let's face it, for many people, that's really the realm of gods and saints, if you like. Honesty would be my second tip. And why pretend to be someone else? I think of my favorite poet, Philip Larkin, who talked about his distaste of performing public poetry readings. And he said, I don't like going about pretending to be myself. And by that, I think he meant he didn't enjoy living up to a public image that had nothing to do with his private life. So I don't have a very great memory, and I'm a shocking actor. So dishonesty is a lousy option for me. The honesty is by far the best policy. That's my second tip. And third, I think humor would always be my fallback position. And so if you can help someone else laugh at their situation and perhaps even laugh at yours, then I think you've done something quite wonderful. And it reminds me of another great poet, the American Robert Frost, who so charmingly expressed it when he said, forgive, O Lord, my little jokes on thee, and I'll forgive thy great big one on me. And I think that's the kind of humor, even in the most terrible circumstances, if we can find that kind of humor and share it, then we've got some hope as humanity. So those are my 3 tips. How's that?
They are truly wonderful and insightful. I can feel just how profound they are, how really deep into the essence of humanity. Like you can't get much more grounded than talking about having love as a definition of success, or success in terms of a mindset. As we were talking earlier about, the different war zones and other terrible conditions around the planet throughout history, what's also been there, and even through COVID, as we've noticed, is this love of each other and this love of humanity. And you see, I always love people that talk about the balance. And so, there's negativity in the world, but there's also this beauty and caring and loving. And when we had COVID start, we actually saw so much of that come out in people. There was just as much negativity going on as there was beauty. And everybody would have seen on Facebook the kindness pandemic and other platforms where people are constantly now sharing what we would think of as good news stories, but they're essentially people being kind and loving towards other people, complete strangers. So I really celebrate the success for a mindset is that love, because you never know if the circumstances around you are going to change. But if you keep focusing on that love, then I do believe you can weather through anything.
I believe so too. And, my tips might seem a little romantic or perhaps a little fuzzy, but at the same time, I think without the gentility and the kindness that we have as humans, unlike any other species, if we ignore them in favor of the prosaic and the practical and the mathematics and the processes and all of the stuff that go toward making a business or an organization, then I think we lose our purpose a little. We certainly lose our sense of human direction and we become machines. And that's not who we are or what we should be.
I so agree. I think one of the things that I do with clients quite a lot is talk about the human condition. People are so programmed now to think that, if I do X, then it will clear this, this, and this, or if I do Y, it'll sort out this, this, and this. And sometimes there's elements where it just comes back to the human condition that, you're always going to make a judgment, no matter how much you say to your mind, I'm going to walk into this room and never make a judgment again in my life. We're sort of hardwired to walk in and make judgments. So that human condition and then how you deal with it and how you act with it all comes back to love and kindness, whether it's to yourself or to others. And so I love your three suggestions because they come back to that the way I would describe it is the human condition and that essence of who we are and what we are here for.
Yeah, well, I'm very fortunate in that respect, in so much as I get to hear so many astonishing stories. And I have done all my life being put into sometimes dangerous situations, often tragic, often terrible, often miserable, but also regularly transcendent, where people have taken such misfortune and have lived with so little and yet have so much to give in return. And often it's the poorest of the poor who are the happiest of most. And I've seen this again and again. So I'm so lucky to be able to hear these stories, report on them, and in some cases even reconstruct them for a larger purpose.
Fabulous. And I know that one of those, and I'm glad we got to that and have the time to talk a little bit about your latest book, the Covert Chronicles, which was very much for me, again, where you were looking at the human condition throughout COVID last year and then writing those sonnets. So what were some of the themes that you saw come through?
Look, most of all, I think, was the sense of social connection, that despite this monstrous wave of malignancy that had gripped the world, and I mean malignancy in the coldest possible sense, because this is an uncaring, careless, thoughtless, biological hazard that none of us had ever encountered before. So there's not a living soul, or very few, who may have survived the Spanish flu 100 years ago. So this was all new territory for our generations. And the way people reacted on the whole was, I thought, magnificent in terms of helping out neighbors and the elderly and looking out for each other. And yet there were also lots and lots of different angles to consider, particularly, the great nations of the world and how they responded to the pandemic from the very beginning in terms of taking or admitting or denying any involvement in its spread, to the way smaller countries got to grips with it as well. And so there were so many angles to pursue that I was astonished to be lucky enough to capture some of them, which I did for the first 75 days. I wrote a sonnet a day for 75 days, thinking by then it was all over. And so I stopped. But my beloved wife, Sandy, with her technical and technological skills, insisted on publishing them daily, and the interest re-sparked as the second lockdown in Melbourne happened, and suddenly the pandemic was back and on us and worse. And so I took to the wheel again and wrote another 25, and then decided that that was enough. It happened to coincide with the departure of Donald Trump, which I saw as being somehow prophetic. And that's how the book ends.
Wow, how incredibly profound. And I'm sure a great gift for, 100 years from now, when they're looking back on this 100-year episode and going, what was created and how were people thinking and feeling. And I'm sure that those 100 sonnets will be a real insight for people into what was going on and how people were coping and going through. I know
I'd like to think so, but I have a feeling medical science won't be that generous and let me live that long to have a look at it.
You never know. Yeah. With consciousness, especially with some of the technology coming out. But yeah. I also think it's really lovely that you were recognising as well that humanity, faced with this, that there's nothing more levelling than the fear of death. And with COVID, it was non-discriminatory. It was everybody anywhere can get it. So everybody had that sense of mortality that we learnt to then live with as we progress through 2020. And now it's a case of how do we live with it going forward and the controls, etc. But that great leveler of humanity, the things even here in Australia where we've had bushfires and floods and this and that, I really have this sense that especially in Australia, we've had many different ways of coming back to, and I love your three things, it's about the heart, it's about honesty, and it's about humour. And those things I believe Australians have in great abounds. And it gets refined in a sense whenever we have these great tragedies and great challenges that we go through as a collective, as a society.
We truly are a extraordinarily fortunate country. And it seems to me if we can hold the faith, but also retain our humility as people who welcome others of less fortunate status than ourselves, then I think that fortune will continue.
I believe it will. And, we are very, very lucky where we are, not just geographically, but with having had so many wonderful, diverse cultures bring their best to Australia.
Oh,
so if you were to talk to Melbournians who happen to be in COVID lockdown yet again, what would your sonnets of today say then? What would be some of the themes that we would be bringing out?
Look, I don't think that I would write anything particularly differently. The challenges and the difficulties and the uncertainties remain much the same, even though, astonishingly, the two accepted vaccines on the market have been developed in an incredibly short space of time. The question, I suppose, is whether they will act swiftly and permanently to give us some measure of immunity to this pandemic, or will they also transform, mutate into something equally unknown and therefore even more challenging? I don't have the answers to those questions. I can only pose them and theorize and hope people will think about them themselves.
Wonderful. And I think that that's so true that just like in a strange way, just like in the days of Socrates and Aristotle, all we can really do, because we can't control COVID, we can't control the mutations, we can't control a lot of what's happening geopolitically from our level. So it really is like asking the questions, and that's why I love this program of asking people, what's success? What's a successful mindset? Because it really asks those important questions of today that I think people need to be thinking about and hearing, and it all comes back to love. But what does that love look like, and how can we be more loving and kind to each other?
Agreed.
Fabulous. Well, it's been such a gift having you on the show today. And if people wanted to connect with you and to buy a copy of your book, the COVID Chronicles, what would be the best way for them to find you, Roger?
LinkedIn would be the best way to start. But if they wanted to look at the book and possibly buy it, they can go to my website, which is rogergmcdonald.com, I think.
That's all right. I'm sure they'll find, if you Google Roger McDonald and
Roger
also
G. McDonald's. There are
Roger
two
G.
Roger McDonalds, unfortunately. There are more than two, but there's another who is also well known as an author, so people get them confused.
And also they can Google the COVID Chronicles. I'm sure that will also help them to find yourself on there. And my guests, I like to ask this question, and it tends to get asked by the viewers on social media each week. If you were to talk to your younger self and to give your younger self some advice, what do you think that those pearls of wisdom might be? What type of advice would you give yourself?
I think that's an easy one, and it's been an answer I've had for quite some time, and it would be to read the 1997 Massachusetts Institute of Technology commencement speech that Kurt Vonnegut didn't write and didn't make. It was actually written by a Chicago Tribune writer called Mary Schmeek, and it appeared in the Chicago Tribune in June 97. What I take out of it are three things. Don't worry about the future, or worry if you need to, but you'll realize that worrying makes so little difference, it's not worthwhile. Secondly, don't be reckless with people's hearts, and be cautious of people who are reckless with your heart. And the third lead, I would say, is don't waste your time on jealousy. The race is long, and in the end, it's only against yourself, and death always wins anyway. So those would be my three thoughts to a younger person these days.
Do you think there was a little bit of jealousy there when you were younger that you're talking to yourself about?
No, I think I've been miraculously free of it most of my life. Sometimes, it can crop up when things go wrong, and others appear to have more than you do, but in the end, it's still just you and being the best you possibly can be.
What a wonderful way to bring this to a close. So thank you so much for being my guest this week, Roger. It's been a real pleasure having you on the show.
Oh, thank you. It's been great fun, but also the opportunity to regather some thoughts about a particularly challenging time we're going through.
Well, and I'm sure many people watching today have really enjoyed your perspective and hearing some more thoughtful reflections on what is happening today and how, you know, coming from difficult circumstances, you can still create a life and create success and great success throughout your career.
Oh, that's beautifully put. Thank you, Michele.
You're very welcome. Well, thank you all for joining and for watching today. And it's been my real pleasure to have Roger on the show. And so for finishing up again, from my heart to your heart, please be great, be fabulous, and be you.